Good afternoon, everyone. I am Atana Malik, the rapporteur for today's seminar, which goes by the theme Empire and its Aftermath, 1930 to 1989, Rethinking British History. It is my privilege to welcome you all, and most importantly, I welcome Professor Susan Pennybaker. Also to mention that we have misspelled Pennybaker in the posters that we sent around, so we would like to apologize for that. Well, Professor Pennybaker teaches European history at University of North Carolina, and currently she is a Fulbright Nehru Research Scholar at Department of Political Science, Delhi University. She has authored A Vision for London, 1889 to 1914, and From Scottsboro to Munich, Race and Political Culture in 1930s Britain. Her work in progress is Fire by Night, Cloud by Day, Exile, Refuge and Descent in Post-War London. In today's lecture, she is going to highlight the significance of transnational approaches to the history of Britain. Sifting through old imperial and diplomatic narratives and also social and cultural studies of colonial and post-colonial orders, Professor Pennybaker would look at the global context and examine as to how it transforms the history of domestic British. Through various instances of historical significance, she would invite us to rethink what we understand as British history. The chair for this seminar is Professor Ankur Datta, Department of Sociology, South Asian University, and the discussant is Professor Dia Mehra, Department of Sociology, South Asian University. I now request Professor Ankur Datta to please chair the event. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Atina, and a warm welcome to everyone to today's seminar as part of the Sociology Seminar Series of the Department of Sociology, South Asian University. We're very glad to see you all here, colleagues and students, and we're very pleased to have with us here today Professor Pennybaker. Atina has more or less described Professor Pennybaker's work, but what I thought would be interesting to sort of also bring up here is especially Professor Pennybaker's engagement with first the idea of British history and a critical engagement with empire. As yesterday, when Professor Pennybaker come by to the department, she talked about how her work is sort of a critical engagement with opponents and critics of empire first, and especially how the idea of empire has persisted even after the empire has come to an end. Professor Pennybaker has also emphasized that she's critically an urbanist who's done extensive work in London, and this plays a very important part in her work from the beginning. One of the things, well, we are in South Asian University and we've invited someone who's a historian of Britain. And I thought this would actually be very interesting, and it's just a personal view of mine, but many of us from this continent, we're from countries that used to be part of the British Empire until not a long time ago. Most of us had grandparents who were born as subjects of the British Empire. My grandmother keeps talking about the reign of George V and how she was the subject of a king, whereas I never had a king. But what I thought was very interesting as well is that we have been raised on our own grand narratives of colonialism and anti-colonial nationalism across South Asia. However, there's very little engagement with the other side, so to speak. What is empire? What was empire, and what is empire in the first place? What is it like on the other side, especially from the dominant parts of the empire? And Professor Pennybaker's work is also going to show how the idea of empire complicates the meaning of countries that control empire, like Great Britain and other European countries. And I think, again, the question of empire remains relevant for independent nation states in South Asia. I mean, we talk about the incorporation of countries like India and Pakistan in sort of questions of imperialism during the War on Terror, post 9/11. We hear talks about sort of Indian imperialism in Kashmir in the northeast. So we look forward to Professor Pennybaker taking us into a journey into the meaning of the term empire and looking at the aftermath of empire and how it changes the way we look at connections across the world. Professor Pennybaker, they're all yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much. How's the sound? Okay. So I just want to say very briefly, thanks to everyone who made this possible today. I won't try to name all the names, but many of you here have been very hospitable. I thank the students for coming and my colleagues from the Fulbright Nehru program who are here from the US, as well as some other friends and colleagues, including my assistant Vikram Sahi, who's sitting there from Delhi University. I'm going to jump in, but I recognize that there's quite a lot of detailed material here. I've tried to prune it a bit. I suspect that there are people in the room who know lesser and greater amounts. Certainly everyone in this room knows much more about Asia than I do. Okay, so, I will, if I see that the detail is just suffocating you, I will speak in broader strokes, and I'll speak more extemporaneously. But right now I will start by reading and then showing you some images. Yeah, I think I'll manipulate the images. If it doesn't work, then I'll ask you to come forward. So this lecture seeks to explain what's going on in the study of British history in 2013, especially as it's practiced in the UK and the US in the aftermath of the incursions in the Gulf, Afghanistan, and Iraq that have characterized the last period of the development of the Academy. So that global context is very much at the forefront of what I'm going to be thinking about here. There are implications for Indian history and the study of contemporary history generally as well. At the close of the lecture, I will return to some of those. Here's where we're going. I'm going to speak on the rise of a transnational approach in British studies and related fields and its opponents. I'm going to illustrate that approach through a series of case studies drawn from my work on the 1930s. I'm then going to segue to my most recent work on the post-war era, focusing on the problem of South African exiles who came to London during the anti-apartheid era. And then before we move to our discussion, I'll glance at the work I'm doing here right now in Delhi on the movement of Indian activists and members of the Indian political community in and out of London after the Second World War. First, though, a word on the idée fixe of empire, the 19th century, the Raj. The treatment of British imperialism in India and globally before 1930 has witnessed now a revival of liberal empire as a concept that historians in the West, I'm using that term very advisedly, are looking for and looking to celebrate. They look now, I think, within particularly Indian history for examples of the rule of law during the British presence. They look for examples of a limited suffrage here in India. They look for the presence of anti-slavery throughout the empire. And they look for ways to imagine a slow, gradual, and benevolent retreat from empire, and the need to have even stayed longer. And they encase that within a conversation that many of you who work in the social sciences are familiar with, of the notion of the failed state, or states that might be on the road to failure, and attribute part of that to the rapid or violent processes of liberation and independence, assuming from that had the British stayed longer, things might have been different or better. And there's a notion, too, of terrorism, the key word for our time, being somehow now part of the legacy of anti-colonialism and independence. So this is a big problem in the field, this pursuit of a kind of liberal notion of empire. So I'm working very much against that notion, which isn't to say it didn't exist, but the meaning that's attached to it, I think, is something that we need to discuss. So the lead up to 1930 is a deeply contested era for historians now. And it can be used as a time that allows us to imagine the interwar era as the greatest moment of the possibility of imperial reform. Morley Minto, the India Act of the 30s, the voting rights here, all of that. The lost moment before liberalism was eclipsed by fascism and communism in what was to become known as the Third World. So this presentation seeks to unravel that notion of liberal paternalism in the interwar years, to unmask it and to show the deep continuities between imperial and colonial thinking in the era from the 19th century to 1939. One of the greatest continuities is the presence of slavery and the legacy of slavery. And it manifests itself particularly in parts of Africa, the Caribbean, and in the North American landmass. The United States, founded, of course, in 1776, is, after all, a post-colonial society, whether it chooses to use that language to describe itself or not. The new historical approach that I evoke today is one that emphasizes not only the transnational, but as Ankur has kindly said, the opponents and critics of empire. So first going to talk about empire and its aftermath in terms of this work I did on the 1930s, just to give you a feel for the length of it. Here it is. So as we meet today, the field of British studies and its parent British history remains in a period of rapid transition that has overtaken it in the last 2 decades, dare we say, crisis. And a crisis that is much more palpable in the UK, Europe, and North America than in any former imperial region or territory where the subject may not even be taught anymore. If we were to judge by Talheka's recent poll of which books India's political leaders are reading right across the political spectrum, we would find a lot of P.G. Wodehouse, a fair amount of Hobsbawm's old synthetic narratives, and no reference to new transnational monographs. Where am I, amongst those readers? So that one element of this crisis is in the so-called developing world is that Britain remains a museum, a fossilized subject, unworthy of new histories, or one that is best sentimentalized now that the British are gone from most of the earth. Nevertheless, as a North American and transatlantic practitioner of modern British history, this talk is committed to exploring the transition to new ways of thinking about what one studies, researches, and conveys still as British history. That's what I do for a living, to start with. And to sharing some of my own archivally based work on the 20th century that illustrates some of its dimensions. So I begin with this large question, how is race, a contentious term with so many discursive meanings, manifested in the history of modern British political culture? My work on racial politics includes the book in question, From Scottsboro to Munich, and my new book, Fired by Night, Cloud by Day, the research for which has brought me to Delhi, and I'm going to speak of them both now. They're both part of new kinds of histories that are increasingly grouped under the slippery heading transnationalism. But they also take me back to the realm of my earliest work as an historian, to the problems of metropolitan political culture and the ways that London-based liberal and radical activism has influenced the imperial capital since the second half of the 19th century. In positing that discrete history both of the state and the metropole within newly declared transatlantic and global frameworks, many methodological hurdles arise. So, what is Ada Wright? Picture in front of you, a domestic worker, a household servant from Chattanooga, Tennessee, that's in the United States in the South, walking on Fleet Street in the summer of 1932, looking so determined in the photograph before you. What bearing does her presence have upon the Munich conference and its aftermath? This is a conference where the British attempted to appease Hitler and avert the Second World War. How did post-war Britain and London, whose culture was marked by events like the 1976 high school student uprising in the Johannesburg township of Soweto, resonate with the unfinished business of interwar racial politics and the lives of the men and women who engaged them, Ada Wright amongst them? In thinking of these questions and their interconnections, bear in mind a very large feature of the English 1930s, the British Empire, still pervasive, covered a quarter of the globe's landmass, governed 1/4 of its population, over 350 million of whom lived on the Indian subcontinent alone. In the last lines of his bestseller, Empire, How Britain Made the Modern World, the very right of center Harvard historian Neil Ferguson remarked upon the Second World War. The empire had stood alone against the truly evil imperialism of Hitler, even if it did not last for the 1,000 years that Churchill hopefully suggested that it might. This was indeed the British Empire's finest hour. Yet what made it so fine, so authentically noble, was that the empire's victory could only have ever been Pyrrhic. In the end, the British sacrificed her empire to stop the Germans, Japanese, and Italians from keeping theirs. Did not that sacrifice alone expunge all the empire's other sins? Now, this is a seductive question, and it's a timely one for people whom he's teaching at this little-known university, Harvard. Yeah? And he's the chief political advisor from the U.S. to David Cameron, and worked in John McCain's election campaign and such like. Mitt Romney's. So today I want to press home another way of thinking about this question and suggest that we cannot answer it however we answer it without a clear understanding of the myriad forms of racial politics in the 1930s and after, as imperial and post-imperial patterns continued to shape the Cold War and much more in British and transnational political culture. Now, Britain's interwar communities of color numbered 20 to 30,000, comprised largely of maritime workers and migrant laborers, though there had already been 2 Asian members of parliament before 1914 and some black London borough officials. There were very small middle-class contingents, and the sons of some wealthy colonials of color attended Eton and Oxford, as you'll be aware. British Jewry, just to give you a feel, was 10 times this size, numbering 300,000 or more in the same period when you've only got an Asian presence of 20, 30,000 people, along with Afro-Caribbean. So it's a small presence. Still, blacks had long featured on the London cultural scene, and Londoners who had not seen them perform in person were accustomed to their depiction on the music hall stage and the variety theater, as well as in the cinema. Here you see the Duke Ellington, one of our greatest jazz musicians, playing at the Palladium with Ivy Anderson, who was considered his best female vocalist of a very, very long career. So I want you to look now at some excerpts from 2 song sheets from the 30s, and on your left are excerpts from a labor songbook entitled Everyday Songs for Labor Festivals, the 1933 edition that would have been carried by Labor Party supporters in every town in the land, so chief party of the political opposition. Yeah? Along with the Liberal Party dissenting from Tory conservatism, but some Labour people are already in a coalition government that's probably the most right-wing government in British history, that was elected in 1931 when this edition is published. Many of you will recognize, not in this room, maybe Stephen Foster's The Camptown Races, first published in his Plantation Melodies in 1850. It appeared in the songbook alongside Eyes Going Back to Dixie, composed by C.A. White and published in Boston in 1874, whose lyrics included, I miss the old plantation, my home and my relation, my heart's turned back to Dixie, and I must go. Further down the page appeared the Internationale, hymn of the First International, written by Eugène Poitiers at the time of the Paris Commune of 1871. So take a quick look at the lyrics. On the right, you see the lyrics from another page from another songbook. The publisher's name, the Workers' Music Association, which came into being in 1936, belies its links to the Communist Party of Great Britain. In comparison to the Labour Party, a smaller sectarian movement with much less support than the mass communist parties of Germany and France, or India, for that matter, at that point in time. More members in India than in Britain. Look at its rendition of the Camptown Races. Patronizing as it may seem to us in 2013, the original lyrics had been soberly reworked, resulting in a more proletarian and politically correct rendition of Foster's song, Read Them and I Will Too. We march along with a merry song, doo-dah, doo-dah. We're all going strong, we shan't be long, doodle-doodle, doo-dah day. We're out to see that an end shall be, doo-dah, doo-dah, of poverty and tyranny, doodle-doodle, doo-dah day. Going to work all night, going to work all day, till the profit system's all washed up, doodle-doodle, doo-dah day. Doodah, a refrain cast in an artificially conceived Negro dialect, remained. This is still the fight song, by the way, for British football, with different lyrics. You hear it all the time you watch a match. Now let's listen for a moment to a recording that illustrates the mode in which Tories and Liberals, socialists, communists, and fascists alike, most often heard these lyrics in interwar London and Europe, I would not doubt in India, on the variety or music hall stage. The version of the Camptown Races featured the English minstrels with Alexander and Mose performing in blackface. So white guys with black paint on their faces using an artificial darky dialect, so imitating a fake indigenous language, yeah? And they're performing in a 1931 gramophone recording for the Library of Congress, I might add, and they're going to exchange some patter at the end. So they're going to be using the lyrics from version number 1, closer to the Labour Party version. This is the moment of truth, whether this is going to work or not.
The cattle lady keep it strong. Do-da, do-da. The cattle lady kept 5 miles long. Do-da, do-da, I came down the Rethiking. Do-da, do-da. I go back home with a pocket full of things. Do-da, do-da, one run all night, 5 run all day. I fix my tongue in a bobtail bag. Somebody back on the bag.
Well, Mo, how are you feeling today?
I feel like a man wearing a new underwear.
How is that?
Just tickled to death. How are you, Mr. Alexander?
Oh, I'm not feeling too good. In fact, I think I'm going to be ill.
What's going to be the matter with you?
Oh, I don't know, but the doctors say that illness always attacks the weakest spot.
And you're going to have a cold in the head.
Okay. Let me just say, too, Trent, as an interlocutor here, Camptown Race is a horse race, yeah? And gentleman speaking, the protagonist, is going down to bet some money on the races. And he's talking about the horses running all day and all night and taking a limited wage pact and trying to make it into more. Yeah? So he's saying he's going to put his money on the bobtail horse and asking could somebody else bet on the bay horse that's also running. Okay, so that's like just a kind of interpolation. So in April of 1931, a month after what I'm going to talk about next, which is the Scottsboro rape case broke, King George V and Queen Mary attended a royal command performance by the 2 minstrels whom you just listened to at the Palladium. Okay? In the royal party was Mrs. Charles Gates Dawes, wife of the U.S. ambassador. He was the recipient of the 1926 Nobel Peace Prize and a key figure in the reparations politics of interwar Germany and the League of Nations. Mrs. Dawes was joined by the Earl of Athlone, just back from serving as Governor General of South Africa. Athlone Stadium in Cape Town, where the part of the World Cup was held in 2010, bears his name, Athlone Stadium. So you did not have to be a Labour Party member to listen to or sing the Camptown races. And if you were a communist in the 1930s, yes, you took political exception to the lyrics and replaced them with your own Labour militant lyrics, but you still kept the crucial refrain, doodah. The rejoinder from an ersatz African-American dialect, which was part of the dominant version of the song that you'd likely heard from childhood when you almost certainly had not been a communist. The tune remained the same. It served as a metaphor for racial assumption, racial attitude, for race as it informed that particular historical conjuncture, the familiar streetwise transatlantic interwar idiom. So now I'm going to leap from the music hall and the variety show stage to the lynch mob of the Jim Crow South. And I don't know whether, I think you're all familiar with the term Jim Crow. It comes from, again, from a kind of vernacular performance tradition where there's a kind of cartoon character, a vaudeville character who looks like a crow and is imitating a black person. And the era now, in a negative sense, is given the name Jim Crow era. Yeah. So the era of deep racial persecution, segregation, the immediate post-slavery era in the South. So from the period of right after the Civil War up through our time now. So the Jim Crow South is assisted by many, the knowledge of it is assisted by many British travelers' accounts of life in America. And again, Indian travelers certainly also. Writers and politicians made frequent tours of this American South in the 30s, and the British press carried lurid and graphic accounts of many a lynching. So there's a rape case that occurs in 1931. 9 young black men are picked up on a train in Alabama, traveling illegally because they have not bought tickets. They are looking for work. There are 2 white women arrested with them who are dressed as men. The women are taken away separately by the police and browbeat by the police. Not necessarily physically abused, but mentally abused, and their own problems with the law are brought up, and they are induced and pressured to charge these young men with rape, a crime which these young men in this instance did not commit. Okay? They accused them of it in a context in which the crime is a capital offense, and within 4 weeks they are all sentenced to death except for the youngest person, who is a juvenile, and he's sentenced to life in prison. Okay? So this is a big, big case. And the trials, and including appeals that are finally launched, began in 1931. The 9 young black defendants were summarily found guilty of raping 2 white women hobos on a train. The vernacular of the stage became a defense vernacular. Communists and socialists and liberals, all of whom participated in the defense campaign that arose internationally in the wake of capital sentences being handed down in Alabama, deployed the language and imagery of the Camptown races that we've just heard, often mixing with the language of communist-style appeals to the proletariat. And here are the 9 defendants. That's from a London newspaper of 1935. Now these are words that were penned by others but attributed to the 9 young defendants. So these appear in the left press. From the death cell here in Kilby Prison, 8 of us Scottsboro boys is writing this to you. They are called Scottsboro boys because this is the railroad town in which they are arrested. Okay? We have been sentenced to die for something we ain't never done. So improper English. Us poor boys been sentenced to burn up on the electric chair for the reason we is workers, and the color of our skin is black, what we guilty of. So this is an attributed piece of language. So, Mrs. Wright, whose picture you saw at the beginning, is the mother of 2 of those defendants in the rape trial. Roy and Andy Wright, and that is why she is in London in the summer of 1932. She crossed from Jim Crow America to Germany in the auspicious summer of 1932. This is when Germany is experiencing the last throes of anti-fascist labor strikes. And she sat with an international labor defense leader called Louis Engdahl from the US in the white sections of the liner, for the first time in her life, able to actually sit in an integrated transport facility on this ship. And the ship docks in Hamburg, and there's a picture of Hamburg before it's bombed in the Second War. It's bombed profusely at the end of the Second War. This is also the center of European communist work amongst black and Asian seafaring laborers, who made up significant numbers of the harborside population of the city. So along with Liverpool, Bristol, Cardiff, London, Marseille, and Paris, Hamburg had one of the largest communities of color in the European world of the 30s. So many Asian laborers coming from this part of the world would have docked on ships in the Hamburg harbor. The Communist Party internationally has a contingent of people there to greet them when they arrive. Multiracial group of people on the left, literature directed to them about the regions they come from. So Ada Wright, who's herself the member of a primitive Baptist congregation, whose grandmother was born in slavery, makes her way across Britain and Europe through the offices of Red Aid, a very large network of mass relief and propaganda organizations that were affiliated to the Communist International and reported to Moscow. And she saw many Europeans that summer, not just communists, but liberals, social democrats, trade unionists, and ordinary people on the street who came to hear her and to see her. in those instances in which she was permitted to speak. When she often invoked a melodramatic portrayal of 19th century slavery to enforce the cry to free her sons. And by the way, the campaign, you'll appreciate this in the context of Delhi 2013, the left continued to characterize her accusers as not credible because they were prostitutes, when in fact they were women mill workers. And the whole definition of prostitutes now and then, has a very complicated and contingent history, but it was invoked against them for a long time during this defense. Okay? So she went to London and to England and to Scotland in 1932 for 10 days, visiting Wales also. She arrived at a press conference in Fleet Street, the picture we started out with the British International Labour Defence Leader and trade unionist Bob Lovell by her side. And if you could see closer to the picture, there's a woman turning back to stare at them in the middle, because it still would have been quite unusual to see a black woman carrying a briefcase on Fleet Street, who clearly was in clothes that would connote that she was not herself necessarily an African. Let me add that in meeting her family, I was told that in the days before metal detectors, they're pretty sure she was, to use the American phrase, packing, meaning she has a pistol in her brassiere. So you see how the front of her is sticking out a little bit there. And this is the mother then of two of these defendants. Now, I don't want to let the whole story overtake us. You can ask me about it, but one of the crucial things that happens to strengthen this, and again, you have to imagine this in terms of what we are living through now in Delhi, is that one of the women accusers goes over to the defense and confesses, including in court, that they were not raped by these guys, okay? So that happens in the course of the defense campaign. Then the doctors who examined the women that night, who had been too cowardly to come forward initially, ultimately come forward and say the medical examinations were indubitable, that there had been no sexual intercourse on the night in question. Okay? So you've got to, this just makes things more complicated in a discourse that we're all already involved in, but it's important to put it on the historical record and to look at the racial context there. Okay? So Mother Wright ultimately left Britain and goes back to the South. She never leaves the United States again, but there's a big campaign in Europe and around the world on the behalf of the defendants, on the grounds of the racism of the American South and the injustices of it. And it's led for several years in England by the poet Nancy Cunard, who's a lefty who worked with many kinds of political organizations and associations across London to mount a spirit of defense, and one of these was the League Against Imperialism, here seen waging a protest at Trafalgar Square. This organization was the successor to a global association founded in Brussels in 1927, the League Against Colonial Oppression. Vijay Prashad is here, who's written on that moment also, in which many British activists were involved. Cunard never joined the Communist Party. She doesn't look very much like she did there. And her involvements in Scottsboro brought many notables on board as signatories, from the chief rabbi to Cunard's literary and artistic cronies, if these names mean anything to you. Ezra Pound, Augustus John. In Britain and on the continent, Charlie Chaplin, Albert Einstein, Thomas and Heinrich Mann, Leonard and Virginia Woolf. The great playwright Samuel Beckett were also signatories. The embrace of London's arts and literary celebrities came complete with dances, fetes, concert fundraisers in which expatriate African-American entertainers also participated. A summer 1933 gala fundraiser in London at the Phoenix Theatre featured the Mississippi Page Boys, the Black Flashers, the Gold Coast Quartet, and Black Bottom Johnny. Now, among Cunard's closest associates was the Trinidadian intellectual George Padmore, the former Malcolm nurse who directed the Comintern's Negro Bureau in Hamburg when Ada Wright first arrived in Europe. The grandson of a slave and son of a schoolmaster, the former medical student Padmore had left the port of Spain in the Caribbean in 1924 and joined the American Communist Party. When Padmore later departed New York and his wife and daughter for the Soviet Union, he was barred from ever re-entering the country again. Never did ever re-enter the United States. In Moscow, he joined an international circle that included the young Ho Chi Minh. From Moscow, he was sent to Germany to begin his work in Hamburg. Okay. Thought I had. Yeah, okay, so this is Padmore, 1937. He's the hero of my book. And he's a very important person even to the history of opposition to the British Empire in India. And he's someone that Indian revolutionaries met and knew in this period. So he is working at this time with a European organizer of Comintern relief and defense campaigns, including Scottsboro, who's a sensational impresario of the period, Willy Munzenberg, the guy in the middle of this photo. He's a former German youth leader from a working class background who had participated in the German revolutions of 1918-19. By the time the late 30s come, Munzenberg is the sole living Bolshevik-era KPD German communist still on the scene. So it's a very important person, and he develops a strong anti-racist following and is a crucial organizer of the left in Europe in his generation. So here he stands with the communist leader James Ford, who's from the United States, believe it or not, and a veteran of World War I in France, the person on your left, and Guérin Kouyaté, an organizer and former teacher from French Sudan, who became a close associate of Padmore's in Paris. And Padmore edited something called The Negro Worker, a shipboard publication that was sold in bookstores and smuggled even in Bibles across the globe from New York to Port of Spain to Cape Town to Nairobi to Paris. He wrote on the exploitation of labor in the British and other European empires as a wry and visionary critic of imperialism in all of its guises. I hope this part will interest you especially. The Negro Worker, like many kinds of interwar era left propaganda, contended that the USSR, the Soviet Union, was a racially harmonious entity in which ethnic differences were transcended, a powerful claim upon the loyalty and interest of African American and other fellow travelers of the 30s. The insistence upon the celebration of multiracial assimilation and racial progress was a mainstay of Soviet doctrine, often wielded against, bless you, portraits of the racist American South. The IOP's new leader, it's not a communist publication, anti-Stalinist left socialist publication, wrote openly of the Siberian camps and the Moscow trials, but it also ran this photograph of children in the Caucasus. So there's an enormous interest in Central Asia as a kind of racial other where equality prevails. So Kazakhstan, but other parts of the region are constantly visited, not only by Indian communists and people on the left in India, but also by persons of color as well as white radicals from the other side of the globe. So it's a big, manipulated, if you will, but propagandistically, but a very important region of travel and investigation. Now, I will add here that Padmore falls out with the Communist Party, and he leaves it. So his story becomes one of an ex-communist who takes on many, many guises politically in the period after this. He's also arrested in 1933, just as he's leaving, by the Gestapo, and he's imprisoned in Germany for several months and then deported to the UK as a British subject, where he's met at the ship by security agents who continue to follow him from the rest of his life on this earth. But as he's leaving the circles of the CP, the last issue that he edits of Negro Worker comes out, and in it is an editorial that says, most Negroes in Europe and America, as well as the colonies, do not yet fully realize that fascism is the greatest danger which confronts not only the white workers, but the most hostile movement against the Negro race. And goes on to talk about how the Nazis had supported the Alabama government in their case against the Scottsboro boys, so-called Scottsboro defendants. So I'm going to turn now to the episode that begins to attract Padmore's attention and is another kind of example of a transatlantic social movement that crops up right at the same time as Scottsboro and after Hitler has come to power, and that is the campaign around the Italian invasion of Abyssinia. Just pause for a minute. This is Negro worker taking on the Scottsboro case, and it's February, March 1933, just after Hitler's come to power. And notice that it says down with imperialist terror, freedom for all class 4 prisoners, with a picture of one of the Scottsboro defendants on the front. So, Padmore moves to London, as I've said, and his roommates, peers, and companions include a North London Jewish activist, Dorothy Pizer, whom he takes as his partner, and she takes on his name, Dorothy Pizer Padmore. He also there meets and begins to collaborate with Jomo Kenyatta, the future Kenyan president, and Ralph Bunche, who becomes an American UN-era diplomat of real prominence later in his life. So they form something called the International Friends of Ethiopia and the African Friends Service Bureau. And they collaborate with Sylvia Pankhurst, who had been a suffrage leader but is now deeply involved with the issue of the Italian presence in North Africa. And she edits a newspaper called Ethiopian Times and Orient Review. And they oppose Mussolini. And they organize in solidarity not only with the Ethiopians but with the exiled Haile Selassie, who is making his way also to England. And they began to defy the Soviet Union's decision to enter the League of Nations and what they see as her compromising deals with Mussolini. And finally, Addis Ababa falls in May of 1936. And this is part of an enormously orchestrated US, UK, European, but certainly also in other parts of the world, anti-fascist struggle against the incursion into the African continent by a European power. One of the trickiest features of the campaign to oppose the Italians is that there was still slavery in North Africa, and including in Selassie's Ethiopia. So anti-slavery people who also were sympathetic to Mussolini began to raise this issue. And indeed, this is a picture from 1930, before the invasion, of women in chains and men, in this photo, boys in the former Abyssinia, Ethiopia. But at the same time, of course, the enslavement of Africans that occurs under Mussolini is an enormous threat to liberation. So this is one of the critical debates that occurs transnationally, if you will, in the lead up to the war. Two of the people who support the Italian presence and who are going to be critical in trying to buy off Hitler are the first Foreign Secretary and then Home Secretary John Simon. You know him in India because he is the head, before all this, of the famous Simon Commission. And this is what he's up to next. He and his wife is the leader of the anti-slavery society. They are busy going around, in this instance, seeing refugees from the Spanish Civil War. But they are people of an enormously pernicious politics in the lead up to World War II, because what they managed to do is come up with a defense of Mussolini on the grounds that Mussolini promises to abolish slavery in Ethiopia once the Italians are fully in control of the country. Right? And he also was involved in something some of you study diplomatic history may know, the Hoare-Laval talks and all of these efforts to try to bring Hitler, Mussolini, and the British together to solve the problems of not only the world, but specifically the problem of making sure that the Soviet Union doesn't move ahead, and trying to isolate Russia and to cut separate deals that might well sacrifice the peoples of Central Europe in the balance. So this is insidious, and it is just so you know, these are not Tories, they are liberals. They are in the Liberal Party, okay? So you need to get a feel for the British political spectrum and how it looks to address these politicians using the kind of methodology I'm talking about, with a full view of their global record, not just their domestic record, brought to bear. And you do get a discourse. That is, you get people like, in this instance, Leonard Barnes, who is a great colonial office apostate, someone who went to the Middle East as a young man, who was way up in the Foreign Office, who quit and turned against his British colleagues, saying things like, if the colonies are good for us, they are good for Germany. If they're bad for Germany, they're bad for us. However much some of us may dislike Nazi race theory, the leading principles of that theory do in fact form the mainspring of conduct for Europeans in their relations with dark-skinned races in every colony in the world. There's no firm ground to discriminating between Briton and German when it comes to color prejudice. So this thing is starting to blow up in ways that are moving toward Munich, toward the hour in which Brits are not only going to be saying they want to appease Hitler, but one of the ways to do that might be to give the Germans parts of the empire. And all the Indo-German issues are going to be brought to bear in that conversation. There's a question, which way is India going? Which way are the young people of India going in terms of this contest between Britain and Germany? That's part of this larger global discourse. Now, in the middle of this, I want to back up for a second now and talk about things very well known to you. Gandhi, in the first instance, arriving here in 1931, last trip outside of India. Where does he go? London. After the despised, all-white commission led by Sir John Simon toured India in the late 20s, the British government convened a series of Indian reform discussions in London, complete with Nawabs, colonial policymakers, and politicians. Nehru, by the way, boycotted, still part of the far left, it has to be said, in the late 20s, and still part of a broad left at this time. So Mahatma Gandhi comes, and he's got Naidu by his side there, and he has a full retinue of security people. And this is the conference at which he makes the very unfortunate, it's a little like, who's the academic who just said this at Jaipur? Mandy? You know, it's like you make a comment that forever is recorded. This is where Gandhi speaks about the dumb millions in India, which, you know, it's a figure of speech, but I mean, it becomes highly controversial. So, at the same time, there's a trial going on in India. And it's going to be propagandistically linked now to the rape trial in the American South. And it's going to be propagandistically linked not only to what's happening in Alabama in the courts and in the prisons, but what is now happening in Germany in the period of enormous repression against the left leading to Hitler's coming to power. So there's a trial, it's outside Delhi in this garrison town, and in fact the proceedings are held in what was Ayer's bungalow. If we had all these names, many of you would know them, and many of these people did in fact survive, not all. And there were also 3 white defendants who are part of British communist labor circles who are arrested here. It's the longest treason trial in British history. It's the most expensive. And it plays a huge role in bringing together, to the degree possible, the Indian left. Because every iota of their politics is, as it were, put on trial, covered in the news. People are deeply radicalized in some instances by exposure to this trial. So the British managed to shoot themselves in the foot by trying all these people for such great length of time in public view. It lasts from 1929 to 32. I think you know that Nehru's father plays an important role as one of the lawyers in this case. And in the end, the evidence against these people for conspiring to overthrow the king is so limited that, and the international pressure is so great that it results in short sentences after years of court wrangling. You have people like Harold Lasky, not surprisingly, in London saying, you know, this is a farce, this is a sham. And so it's a very important case. Gandhi visits the prisoners. He's not himself associated with them politically, but also Nehru goes, many other people. It's a big, big case. And Munzenberg and others who organize around Scots who take hold of it. So you actually see meetings in Germany, about India, leading up to 1933, in which the case is being advertised. I'm very proud of this. It's one of the rarer things I have, which is one of the defense pamphlets. It's published by one of the white defendants, written by him, H.L. Hutchinson, and it's a wonderful cover there. You can see the snake of imperialism and the English worker as the the Indian worker as the symbol, and then the hammer and sickle, of course, at the bottom. So that appears on the back of my book. We don't know the artist in question. So now, one of the main proponents of support for the Meru defendants is this gentleman, Shapurji Saklatwala. And he's one of the greatest metropolitan spokesmen that they have, and he's, believe it or not, an independent MP for the South London borough of Battersea. So he's sitting in the House of Commons as a communist during this period. Now, he's born in 1874, a member of the wealthy Parsi family of, complete the sentence, starts with a T and ends with an A. He is a Tata, okay? Through his mother's marriage into that family. They forced him to abandon his chosen career and sent him to England because he was starting to make some trouble here in India. And they thought that this would make him less likely to become a socialist. And once he saw not only racism here, but poverty in London, it's that old story. Like, he sees how people are living in London, he immediately, fluctuates to the socialist left. And eventually will abandon, the family money, etc. He marries a white woman, but his children are introduced into Zoroastrian faith. He remains committed to his faith for the rest of his life, which the communists find just appalling. And he also maintains friendships with people outside of the Communist Party, including political Tories and so on. So he's a very eccentric, maverick figure on the British left in this period, and also a very courageous person. He's the first person to spend a long prison sentence in prison during the 1926 general strike. So, he comes to the CP out of this very long background of activism even before 1914. Worked with Sylvia Pankhurst, was a suffrage advocate. And in Parliament, he is an unabashed critic of India. So when people say, from a historian's point of view, the empire in the 30s, no one really criticized it. It was understood to be, benevolent, and it was going to end, and people really didn't. It's completely fallacious. And we have a record right in Hansard of parliamentary debate where someone like Sock, which was his popular name, is speaking. Is there a single British man or woman today, he says, in any country in Europe, in the Balkan states, in any of the small nations which are not yet so fully developed as Great Britain, that's his Marxist formulation, who would tolerate for one day a power so despotic and arbitrary as the crown under the imperial system is insisting upon enjoying in India? So he's an orthodox communist. He's loyal to Stalin's Soviet Union. He idealizes the Transcaucasian republics. He goes there often. His political outlook is also linked to anti-colonial South Asian activists on the broader left, dating back to the era of the First World War, a variety of Indian nationalists operating out of Berlin. You will know of Chattopadhyaya, forgive my pronunciation, and the Ghadar Party anarchists who chose San Francisco as their base. Yet another strand of radical expat Indian militancy with strong ties to, for example, the anarchist Emma Goldman. Saklatwala was among the party who greeted Mrs. Wright when she came to London in 1932. And we see him here addressing a crowd in Hyde Park about the trial of defendants accused by the Nazis of burning down the Reichstag. And he shares a central critique with Padmore, that when he feels that there isn't enough recognition given to communists of color in terms of the way that the Europeans are conducting a number of campaigns, and particularly anti-fascist campaigns. I'm going to try to move more quickly now to get us into the latter part of the talk so we can have some discussion. So meanwhile, Munzenberg, he's still operating inside Germany, but in 1933, the left are the first people that Hitler attacks, and he and his wife, Babette Grosch, flee to Paris, and they continue to conduct an opposition to fascism there that involves many, many people across Europe and in other parts of the world, many Jews, but also exiled leftists from every background who are the enemies now of the Third Reich. He continues to report to Moscow. He actually travels there periodically from Paris. He and his wife later record seeing evidence of the Gulag. Ultimately, her sister, who also flees there, is going to die in the camps. Chattopadhyay, the great Indian revolutionary, is going to die in the Gulag. So I think you know that many people now are fleeing places where they will not be safe. And this applies in all parts of the world, not just in the countries that are turning people back, but those who are taking them in, and they may find themselves then in very difficult circumstances. In this context, there is a mock trial of the so-called Reichstag fire terrorists that's held in London. It's orchestrated by Munzenberg and other people from Paris. Saakadwala is involved in this. So again, you've got the courts being used, as in Scottsboro, as in Beirut, as an arena to argue against fascism. Munzenberg finally himself breaks away from the Comintern or is expelled. It's sort of double-edged. And he has an independent newspaper at the very end of the 30s before the Germans invade France. This is the most important photograph of my book. It's probably the most important archival finding that I made during work in many, many countries. It's a photograph of Spanish Civil War brigadistas who are Germans. So they are in permanent exile. They have had to leave Spain because of the victory of Franco in the Spanish Civil War. The French have put them in refugee camps, and they are reading Munzenberg's Zukunft in those camps, right before the fall of France. They are on every hit list in the world, because they are apostates now of the Soviet Union in the sense that they are like Pumists. They are socialists now, even though they may have been former communists. So Stalin doesn't like them very much, but Hitler likes them even less. And now on top of that, the French government is putting all enemy aliens, so-called, in these camps, which will be very difficult for people to leave quickly when Germany is invaded. Munzenberg is going to also wind up in one of those camps. But this is a very valuable photograph. It's from the Archives Nationales. When France was invaded by the Germans, the Bibliothèque Nationale received a lot of collections from the German police that they never gave to the Gestapo, to the French police that they never gave to the Gestapo, and this was in one of those collections. It's an F7, which if you ever make it to Paris, F7 is very important. These are the police files for Paris. And in there are all files of many, many revolutionaries. So you get a very large mobilization internationally, but particularly in Western Europe, against the fascist presence now in Germany. This is a Hyde Park demonstration in London with a very large Jewish presence, as you would expect. But you also get international relief organizations being formed to help people on the left. Here is the great American communist actor and singer Paul Robeson singing for a benefit in the New Burlington Galleries. If you know German art and all, these are a triptych by Max Beckmann, which has been contributed to this Defense Day. And you get Nehru, and you get the Indian presence in London beginning to come out in favor of relief for victims of fascism. He's now speaking to a sold-out crowd. In fact, this is a ticket for the overflow room, because everything's been sold out. And we see Paul Dutt speaking from the British Communist Party of mixed Scandinavian and Indian descent. Harold Lasky, very well known here. Wilkinson is a woman MP sort of former communist, and Robeson entertaining, and you see Krishna Menon's Indian League, you know, as a major sponsor, and Nehru at these meetings, you know, is a very important presence. Partly he doesn't want to be in India because he's in political hot water here. I think you know that his wife is also ill for most of the 30s and finally dying in Lausanne. So he's spending considerable time in Germany and Switzerland at her bedside. Indira Gandhi, the soon-to-be Indira Gandhi, is an Oxford student. Yeah? So in this photo we have this amazing record of, you know, Nehru's reception in London as a popular public figure like Mahatma Gandhi, with a huge following amongst the British. With Mrs. Pandit at his side, with Indira come down from Oxford, and Krishna Menon then on the far right. And he speaks saying that you can't be against fascism unless you're against imperialism. And this becomes the kind of creed for people who want to see both the freedom of India and opposition to Hitler be successful. Now, we have, right on the eve of the war then, an amazing group of people sort of moving in and out of London. Someone like Padmore is writing for the American Black Press, saying things like the position of Jews under the Nazi regime is as bad as the conditions of Negroes in the southern states of America and South Africa. Saying, it's amazing that he used this word, Germany was planning to make a Holocaust of humanity. That's Padmore, 1937. And you get Munzenberg writing from Paris, peace and freedom must be defended against both Hitler and Stalin. So it's all kinds of sort of factional and political discourse and differences occurring. So, with the fall of France, Munzenberg is assassinated. He's assassinated by Soviet agents who come into the camp where he is, and KGB agents who garrote him and hang him from a tree in southern France. Kouyaté, the school teacher I showed you from Sudan, is picked up by the Gestapo. He dies in Bukavu. Padmore pursues a career of incisive wartime journalism, sometimes with Kenyatta, and they start to organize what will become the 1945 Pan-African Congress in Manchester that some of you will know of, that Vijay has also written about. Nkrumah becomes independent Ghana's first president, and he invites Padmore and Dorothy Pizer Padmore to come to Africa to live in Accra. W.E.B. Du Bois, our greatest intellectual of this period, goes to live in Accra. Folks arrive there after the war. Serious illness, however, besets Padmore. He goes back to London for a doctor's appointment and dies in London in 1959. Sakalvala, by the way, already had died in the 30s, and Nkrumah himself will die of cancer in exile after the CIA-inspired coup overthrows the Ghanaian government in 1966. Gandhi, of course, assassinated in 1948, Nehru dying in 1964, Indira assassinated 20 years later. Ada Wright dies at home in Tennessee in 1965. She entertained people coming down from New York City. Notice she has a Scots scarf on there, which is a trope, as we now say. And this is a family photograph of her still working as a domestic servant in 1965. Now, the Scottsboro defendants, they served 130 years in prison in total. I am still involved now in the South with, today, this week, on Monday, Alabama legislators have introduced a bill in the legislature in Alabama to declare them all not guilty posthumously. This is 2013. Okay. But they outlive most of their supporters in the rest of the world. Consider. People who never served a prison term are simply killed finally in the events of the war. So, I want to shift now and say just a few things about the post-war era, which is what I'm working on now. And I'm going to start by saying something about after the war. Masses of people passed from under British rule, not simply with the blaring of the bugle and lowering of the flag, but through the conflicts that enveloped many zones of Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean, the death toll during Quit India, and in the era of partition, and the counterinsurgency campaign in Malaya, offering early cases in point. That post-war history should not be so easily disentangled from the interwar era that preceded it. This is more than just an issue of a simple historical blind spot. It is not compensatory history. Instead, I propose that racial politics as a category of inquiry allows us new understandings of the bedrock narrative, political history of Britain, and the global relationships in which she found herself in the years before the war, inextricably linked to the Cold War, post-war era that followed and required for its precise understanding and interpretation. The deep ironies of 1930s racial politics were not resolved by the war, as Neil Ferguson's neat query that we started with suggested they were. Retribution was not had so easily upon the British. The tenacity with which white Rhodesians and South Africans and many other empire settlers strove to maintain their rule cost many, many lives. Britain only hesitatingly relinquished her grip, sometimes in the face of overwhelming force, as at Suez, in the face of abandonment by her overlords among nations. The British Labour Party boss, Herbert Morrison, spoke of granting independence to the colonies as giving a child a latchkey, a bank account, and a shotgun. The hope for independence and freedom from racial injustice had been nursed by the documentary and activist currents of the 30s, in which the conditions prevailing in many parts of the British Empire and her dominions form a subject of intense scrutiny and propaganda. This is a news photo of one of the mines on the Rand that portrayed the circumstances of exploited labor in the richest territory in Africa, home to its largest white population. Now, since 2005, I've been working in archives in South Africa and the UK to unravel post-war patterns of metropolitan political culture and question what the influence and activities of groups of former empire political exiles has been upon the London scene. In this way, I'm pursuing the networks and people who appear in my work on the 30s into their lives after the war and inquiring into the lives of those who came after them. Tens of thousands of South Africans, some defying death and imprisonment for their opposition to the regime at home, made their way to points in southern Africa, Western and Eastern Europe, the US, Israel, and Britain during the decades after apartheid's full promulgation in 1948. They weren't the only South Africans to leave, but Britain allowed entry to those who were against apartheid, giving them temporary visas, permits, in an elaborate system of conventions, and these persons were not political dissenters, most were not political activists, but some became so. So I'm studying this relationship now between London and the anti-apartheid movement. I'm going to close now with a series of images that represent that. We're getting a huge mobilization of people against arms sales to South Africa, which both Britain and, of course, Israel were involved heavily in financing. And Britain has a kind of double existence that historians need to look at. It's an ostensibly peaceful, anti-racist, broadly based global human rights movement that locates itself there in one guise, and yet also a paramilitary, communist-led, black-dominated underground movement is also headquartered often in London. And events at home bring intense repression. So you get a series of waves of people flowing to Britain from the events in South Africa. This is the Soweto Rising of 1976, probably familiar to you, in which school children began a civil disturbance in which they are shot by the South African military over the issue of what language they will be taught in schools, rejecting being taught in Afrikaans, demanding to be taught instead in English, which they consider to be the lesser of the two oppressive languages of the country. And a lot happens in London and in South Africa to link these struggles over a long period of time. At the end of it, here in 1994 shot, you see a picture of Martin Luther King being carried in South Africa. I also then began to interview a series of people who were still alive, who had spent time in London, and that's part of what I'm doing here in Delhi now. This is Hilda Bernstein, who died in 2005. It's a photograph that was run in 2006. I was one of the last people to interview her. Someone who came from a Bolshevik family, came into exile in England after being a leading communist in South Africa, and said to me, I didn't feel British. I didn't feel that London was really my home, yet it was familiar at the same time. I was disassociating myself from the intense political involvements of the past. I wanted to feel a sense of security, to be rooted somewhere. I wanted that because of the children. I had deep political differences with him. This is her husband, Rusty Bernstein, also leading communist. She opposed the '68 Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. They argued for hours and hours about it. I thought that at that stage, I could very well have left him if it were not for the children and the financial responsibilities. I didn't ever come to a modus vivendi with him. One choice was to separate from him, and I thought so strongly about what was going on, about my political disagreements with him. I asked why only then had she seen these differences, and so why not much earlier, even in the 30s? I don't really know. I thought he knew more about the politics of communism and what was going on. I underrated my own ability to think independently. But obviously it was there because in the end it became an issue between us, both personally and physically. It was as if I had the plan to separate myself from the Communist Party and the dictatorial extremism that we had engaged in. People like myself who became attached to Communist Party ideals were seeking solutions to all the multiple problems of the world. At a later stage in my life, I began to see that there were no possible easy solutions. So you get this fallout. People beginning to talk very critically about their past political engagements once they're in the UK. And indicating also a problem about what is happening to the South African struggle, how they conceive of its successes or failures, how they look back on it a few years after the 1994 election. Just going to play you now, almost finished, a short clip from an interview I did with a reported South African writer, Mandela Langa, about his own experience coming to Britain, very different from someone like Bernstein, who's not only white, but born in the UK. Langa was fresh out of South Africa as a black African ANC official, coming into the country, immediately greeted by security people and impounded in a facility by Heathrow, from which he is rescued by some member of the House of Lords who happens to be anti-apartheid. I think the sound is better on this one.
Okay, so I'm in Johannesburg on the 3rd of August 2009. I'm in Parkhurst, and I'm going to start by asking you please to just recall your arrival in Britain.
Well, I would say I was, Britain was not a stranger to us, as it could not have been a stranger to anyone who was born or part of what was still part of the empire, in a manner of speaking. But when I was released from Hounslow under the auspices of a Lord Avebury, I hung around London with a couple of my friends, and they showed me the sights, and I was pretty taken up with the place. The first place we went to, strangely enough, was a huge poster exhibition mounted by the Iraqi Cultural Center, which was amazing, to see what people were doing in the Middle East, in other parts of the world, which also included posters from Cuba. So that was my first real memorable encounter with the United Kingdom. It was not so much what was happening there as what was also what was being done by other communities.
So you get a huge variety of response to the process of exile. The enormous enthusiasm that Mandela has for his youth spent in London, where he becomes the arts editor for Sesheba, which is one of the great anti-apartheid journals. Someone like Bernstein, older generation, an experienced communist, beginning to doubt some of the practices, not all, of the CP in her lifetime. So these are very fruitful areas for research if you conceive of London as a center within a very wide global transnational network of continuing political relationships in which the relations with authorities cannot be thrust aside.
Okay, so I'm
just a few more shots from the period right after the war. We have Nkrumah, before the Ghanaian government is overthrown, making a historic visit to the United States at a time when he also is going to see Mrs. Pandit and also meet with Nehru. Here he's speaking in Harlem, and on the reviewing stand in the right of the screen, the last man sitting at the top with glasses is Malcolm X. He, on this visit, has a long discussion. They're going to disagree, certainly over the upcoming war with China. This is going to become a major kind of schism between the two leaders, but they have a history, and the history is not simply Bandung, but it's the history that comes before that I'm speaking to here. You've also got Kenyatta as the longest lived of this crew of people, doesn't die till the 70s. Here he's greeting our great Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall in Kenya. And these folks also must play politics. Here he is hosting the pernicious, and use the word again, Kissinger in Nairobi, the architect of the fall of the socialist government under Allende. Of course, himself a refugee from Nazi Germany. We also get movement, post-assassination movement of Coretta King. Husband is assassinated, as you know, in 1968. Here she is at the House of Commons with two left Labour MPs. Benner Brockway goes all the way back to support for Indian independence in the 1930s. Very long-lived. I met him in my lifetime. I met him in the 1970s. So here he is, entertaining Coretta King after her husband's death. Mandela with the South African Peter Hain, who's a British MP to this day, who was a child exile after his family hosted someone who was executed for one of the first terrorist bombings against the South African state, now sits in Parliament. And finally, I mentioned Athlone Stadium to you an hour ago. Here's Mandela at the last rally before the '94 election in Cape Town in that stadium. One of the reasons why we're up in 1994 in a talk that's supposed to end with 1989 is because it would be my contention, and I think the record upholds it, that the collapse of the Soviet Union is the thing that gives Mrs. Thatcher the space to bless the release of Mandela. So you cannot understand what's actually going on in South Africa without looking at the diplomatic maneuverings that are going on in London and between Thatcher and Botha leading up to that and so on. So that Mandela is himself a piece of this wider sort of new history of the post-colonial and empire that cannot leave the imperial metropolis of London out. I'm going to close there. I think I've given you quite enough to absorb too much. Thanks for your patience.
Yes, we do. I'd like to now invite Dr. Dia Mahara, who is the discussant for
I just wanted to say thank you very much for absolutely fascinating talk, and as you said, lots of material for us to think through. I wanted to ask some, I think, maybe very simple questions, just as a way of framing what we've seen. First, just a comment, which is when you started talking about the need to do this kind of history at the present juncture, and I was wondering what kind of engagement domestic British history and historians have with histories that are written of the colony. I'm thinking about like subaltern studies, for example. How does that kind of history interlocute with this, the kind of project that you're trying to do, and in basic teaching and writing in British history in general. That's kind of a broad comment, but I did have a couple of questions I wanted to ask about the talk, and I suspect my questions would be easily answered if one read your work. So, but given the amount of material you've covered, one is, I'm curious about the racial politics of the encounters within the revolutionary left themselves. I mean, we have here a series of encounters between people who are from the metropolitan areas, and then all of these people coming in from the colonies, and I'm wondering what those encounters were. I realize that there are too many and they're probably very varied, but if you could just give us some sense of the different kinds of a few. My other question was about how empire itself was enabling of this kind of transnationalism. I mean, one of the things that I kept thinking of as I heard your talk was, thinking about contemporary transnational activism. And there were moments when I started to feel like it was almost easier to do this kind of transnational activism in the 1930s without passports, maybe nation states. I don't know if that's the case, but it certainly felt like at moments. And so I'm wondering how it is that empire itself is enabling, and the other enabler I'm curious about is the Soviet Union, which kind of is a somewhat shadowy figure in this talk, but keeps popping up, I guess. And my last point is just really, I'm not so clear in my head myself, but I'm just wondering what is this relationship between the liberalism that you are talking about in the interwar period, which you're trying to critique, and the rise of this kind of revolutionary left. What's that relationship? Okay, I'll leave it at that.
These are really wonderful, deep questions. I'm not going to give you another hour lecture required to answer them, but thank you very much. Start with the last one first. The liberal forces that I mentioned, I think, are crushed in the 30s between these towering engines of, on the one hand, Nazi Germany, very successful as an economy for the first years of the Reich. The Soviet Union making enormous diplomatic deals to sustain herself, and then cutting a deal, of course, with Hitler. That is only outdone by Operation Barbarossa and the reigniting of certain kinds of relationships between the so-called West and the Soviet Union. I think that in the West, again, I'm using the term very advisedly, but because there are liberal elements in India and throughout the so-called Third World as well. Though liberalism doesn't figure strongly in the 30s, we have to see the outcome of the Second World War as a triumph of a form of liberalism and not of revolutionary transformation. You tell me, but I mean, one could make the case that it's a kind of liberal nationalism that begins then to take hold here in India, that we literally see the morphing of certain figures move from the revolutionary left to that miasma. And this kind of liberalism is the dollar and cents of American politics. So that on a global scale, people like Romney and Bush and Obama are all, in a classic sense, liberals of one sort or another. I think that the British and European case is a little more complicated because I think you continue to have an organized left in a way that the United States doesn't really have, except very intermittently in the post-war period. But you also have this very difficult problem of the ways in which the locus of activity of the so-called Third World, particularly in the so-called proxy wars and the military confrontations of the Third World, began to be the central place of suffering, of lives being lost. And so the vagaries and schisms of the European left, or of the United States left, pales in significance to what is now on the boards for Asia, Africa, Latin America. And I would venture that those are unresolved conflicts, including in the Middle East. That just seems to be where we are now. And so I'm trying to make the case that liberalism wanes and waxes, but continues to be, and here I'm not even using the language of neoliberalism, I'm speaking in a much more classic Millerian sense. It's still a great currency of political thought. Obama is making what he considers to be a heroic attempt to revive its basic nostrums in the United States right now. So the contest between his politics and those, say, of the welfare state, which arguably were politics that gripped South Africa, that gripped India, the compromises with capitalism that the South African and Indian states have made, become also generators of a kind of liberal nationalism that is a very potent force in the world now. And that many people would choose as against what they would see as the religious movements, either, of any stripe. So, that's a very vague and general answer, but it gives you a sense of where I'm coming from. Encounters between people are fundamental to what we're talking about here. So that someone comes into town, they see everyone. And you have enormous records of that kind of interaction. And one could make the case that people of color, regardless of their political differences, also congregate together. So that people on the Indian left broadly are spending some time with people from Africa, that African Americans who come through may well see these people. There are always white allies, who really become people who spend a huge amount of time with people of color, unlike most white people. And they're very important to the story, and they figure throughout. So I think those encounters, I'll just give you one little nugget from the archive, which is, I was criticized somewhat in this book for bringing Nehru so much into play with Sakuntala. Why? In the archive in Timurti, you will see an account of Nehru arriving at Victoria Station on the day of Sakuntala's death, being taken to his wife. The first person to enter the house when Sakuntala dies is Nehru. So, there's still all this kind of networking and interactions that has been, as it were, airbrushed from some of the history that we are accustomed to now, as people have refashioned themselves. The Kenyatta embrace of Kissinger, you would not know that this guy was running to Moscow in 1927, and most of them never were there, and so on and so forth. So it's important. Now, is it as important as what can we call the subaltern history? No, it's just part of that wider picture. So if you want to find subalterns in this story, they are the Scottsboro defendants. They are the women accusers of the Scottsboro defendants. They are the people from rank and file, working class, and below even the working class, who get involved willy-nilly in these things. Ada Wright, she's a domestic worker. An enormous tenacity and courage, which I believe comes very much out of her own religious background, to be able to go to Europe and talk to people. So I think that those methodologies are there, and those people are there. It's an enormous, ambitious task to try to integrate all of this. And what I'm hoping is that in the younger generation, people will just take pieces of this and try to fine-tune them. That these are suggestions. They're crude suggestions about the way things could go. And I just close by saying that in my own work, I'm hoping that the study I'm doing now will be more refined, or that will deal like the Hilda Bernstein quote. You saw how amazed she's talking about her marriage, and I'm not sure I would publish all of that, but when you're dealing with talking to people of my generation or slightly older in an ethnographic sense, and some of you are anthropology people there, then you're in another terrain. You can get at a deeper, the realm of the sexual, the intimate, the private begins to merge, the personal, the family, with the wider political script. And this is something that's been very, very important when talking to South Africans. And maybe it will also become so when I'm interviewing people from India over the next 3 months. How are their life stories connected to their political lives, to the degree that they want to talk about that. So I hope those things are helpful. But thank you, those are wonderful comments.
Thank you. We'll now open it to the floor, and should we take 2 questions at a time?
Yeah, please.
Let's try taking, okay, let's, 4? Okay, we'll take 4 questions at a time.
Or comments, if you just have something you want to say, please.
Questions, comments? When you ask your question, please just say who you are. We had one hand raised earlier, so Malika.
I'm Malika, I teach sociology. I found your presentation. Okay. I found your presentation really fascinating, and I look forward to reading your book. In fact, especially this kind of framework of transnationalism is particularly useful, I think, in a university like South Asia University, which is trying to kind of come to grips with regionalism in a completely new context. But what your framework sort of reminded me was something rather specific that I moved recently here from South Africa, and they have been talking about this whole kind of intercontinental connections, and especially working with Professor Keith Hart. I think he was working on a book on C.L.R. James, the experience of Gandhi on the work of C.L.R. James. So it's not published yet, but we kind of heard that connection a couple of times. And I was just curious that, although you mentioned Joe Patmore, a close friend of hers, he is a central figure in your book. Was there any reason why you haven't included C.L.R. James? That's a curious question. And the second question I had was, what you said about South Africa and apartheid as a sort of unfinished business of the world wars and imperialism. I mean, that's kind of really interesting, and they all, the 1990s changes. I mean, it wasn't only South Africa, but the whole series of other countries who have this kind of national transformation. And Nepal is the country where I come from, work and had this national transformation, but also Mongolia and several others. And the way to understand these kind of national transformations that happen about a half a century after the independence movement of India, or what happened in other parts of the world. I mean, how do we understand that? And I was thinking about what Michael Hirschfeld said about crypto-colonialism, that the world seems to be kind of so obsessed about post-colonial studies as modern studies that you use this colonialism as a kind of major reference point, that the world then kind of doesn't give as much attention to what is a kind of colonial as opposed to being post-colonial. Just wanted your comment on that.
What was that last? What colonial as opposed to colonial?
Well, I mean, I don't really know. I'd say a-colonial, or something that doesn't have a clear difference to the colonial kind of development, as opposed to the post-colonial kind of countries that have.
Anyone else?
Okay.
Well, we can pass this down.
Thank you, Mr. New. Yeah. Thank you so much for that presentation.
Can you just introduce yourself?
Oh, my name is Devashri, and this is now on.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so maybe 2 or 3 quick comments. One curiosity question. I'll start with the curiosity question. I'm interested a lot in certain interwar internationalisms and the kind of circuits of ideas, movement of ideas, people, and cultural artifacts. I study cinema and history of cinema in Bombay. And a lot of my work is now becoming about the movement of people who, like Sakatwala, were sent to London for self-improvement because they were creating a lot of trouble back home. A lot of them end up at the India House. I was just interested in anything that you've come across about the India House in London and the radical anarchist kind of hotbed that it became, and certain important figures there like Veer Savarkar, etc. And a lot of cinema personalities that emerged from there. Because this India House kind of nexus becomes very interesting for various things. And also how, for me at least, the kind of study of history of encounters and movements in this interwar period becomes, I mean, the carrier for this seems to be primarily interwar Marxist internationalism and the various kinds of strains of left ideologies and thought that then get suppressed with the formation of the nation state. So there's so many figures that you never hear about again. And perhaps those figures you never hear about again are because they are actually more radically cosmopolitan thinkers who were interested in decolonization as anti-imperialism and not necessarily as a patriotic nationalist project. And then when you ended with your quote and about him reaching London and then going for the Iraq poster exhibition, I'm thinking, and also the woman talking about her husband. I mean, it's not so much for me a history of the sexuality, domestic intimacy, privacy debates embedded within the ethnographic grounds, as other histories are hidden by the left of gender, and so many female comrades and their thoughts and ideas that we never ever think about. They were there, you see them in photographs somewhere at the back. So religion and gender again as these others. So you talk about race, but you have the Middle East, you have the Muslim other, you have the female other, and they're all comrades, and they're all joining hands across Paris, San Francisco, Bombay. So just a few comments, and yeah, thank you.
Okay, yeah. So I'll start with the last one. I think that the issue of hidden gender histories is obviously right at the center of what you've been listening to today. Just like there would be topics I could raise here, Indian partition is one where you would know a variety of histories that might hide or not hide certain things. The Scottsboro case and everything surrounding it has a huge historiography. Virtually no one speaks about the racism that the left itself felt toward the defendants or their families. Virtually none of the early histories take account of the families of the defendants or their mothers or the religious background of someone like Ada Wright, who's never going to be, as it were, a communist convert per se. You know, she's from an evangelical Baptist background. More than evangelical, primitive Baptist, meaning strict, laying on of hands, you know, strict attendance, discipline that's way, way on the outer perimeters of even the black church in the South. So I think that those things are embedded. I think that they come out in the post-war era in conjunction also with the rise of feminism within the left, internationally. So, you know, Hilda Bergstein is a very prepossessed woman. She's not going to sit there and say that feminism had any particular impact on her, but clearly it did. And in fact, there are cases of people who came to Britain, you know, working in a capacity where women's issues, so-called, or issues of gender or sexuality, so-called, were not part of their repertoire, and then they became increasingly involved with those. There's always the tension, though, between, you know, the larger proportions of struggle and the given case, you know, gender, sexuality, and so on within that. And there's no question that those of us who lived through the period, I can speak, you know, as a veteran of it, the hierarchies, you know, are constantly being contended on. You know, when you have something like the events of the Vietnam War going on, obviously there is an argument that that's taking precedence, that that's not a gendered event. You know, even though now we might completely reposition that history, that feminism is over here and the real theater is there in Asia. So I think this sense of the negation of privilege, of trying to move away from privilege, this has just arisen in the deepest way with this gang rape discourse here. You know, for the absolute insistence that notions of privilege are important, but they are not the whole analysis that we bring to bear on that episode. You know, that it's a very, as it were, important episode in its own right. And so, you know, I think that these tensions are just constants in the 1930s, when you have still a very proletarianized world in England, in the United States, where you have a very, very large, overwhelming working class that is living in circumstances of considerable poverty. So that presses against as your question implies, this whole script. And I think that after 1945, that's different. That there is the recognition of the conditions of the so-called third world that begins to press on that other formation and change people's consciousness who are working on all sides. So yes, gender and religion are very important, but how is it that they come out in the sources, and when do they come out? I mean, those are questions of great, I think, historical specificity, at least from my perspective. Yes, I agree that far-left formations and anarchists and people who are not part of the Communist International are very important. I would also simply say to you polemically, people do not remain communists for their whole lives often. They may go in and out of the communist movement. It's still, a great anti-racist movement in its ideals, and so it has to be reckoned with. And so we can't, I think about, any of this outside of thinking about the positioning of communists, but there are many other people, and in my case, I come out of a non-communist political background, of the far left, but anti-Stalinist. And so, I'm erring here on the side of not slamming the CP in a way that I would have in my own political background. But that's partly because of what I've learned, too, about this period. By the way, the new South African archives are supposedly going to reveal Mandela's definitive membership of the SACP throughout the entire period of his incarceration. So much of that was facade in terms of how he was promoted as a kind of liberal humanitarian figure who was deeply engaged with the Communist Party, which for any of us who know the history ought to be apparent. So, okay, so then I can't answer everything. India House, it's coming up a lot more after 1945 than it's coming up earlier, but right now, for example, the Krishna Menon papers are restricted access, and so there are things about the India League in the interwar that I think would start to lead toward some of your questions for the 20s and 30s, and then I think that India House is writ large. What's that, Asia Publishing House, I think it's called in London, is the first one that the independence government began to assist. So there are things like this unexplored archives. There's all the radio archives of the BBC as well. That's very important. And, so we could chat for a bit after, just archivally, which maybe I haven't done enough of, but it's just too much to take on here. James, C.L.R. James, he's very important. He's a boyhood friend of Padmore's. They meet again. There's people say, "Oh, I have someone you ought to meet." It's like Delhi. Why don't you meet someone and you already met that person 2 months ago, kind of thing. It's small circles often. So someone says, "I want you to meet someone," and it's James, and so they come back together. James is a huge influence on Padmore, and I just didn't speak about him because I didn't speak about him. He's in the book, and he's important. I will say that he's a very idiosyncratic character. He also is in the United States for the whole the war. This shapes his whole consciousness. He's deeply influenced by American race relations at the end of the 30s and in his time in Detroit. Okay, he's also, of course, part of the Trotskyist left broadly. So that it's his connection to the Independent Labor Party in the 30s that opens a door for Padmore and Kenyatta to move in those circles. And I think my book would satisfy you on at least that front. Okay, these South African questions that you raised. A-colonial, post-colonial. I don't know about the language, but I do think the idea that the so-called BRIC nations plus South Africa are their own colonists within their region is a very important problem. Apropos of Kashmir, apropos of, the border issues for India, apropos of the South African issues with Zim, apropos of South Africa's former relationship with the present-day Namibia, apropos of Brazil's relationship with the surrounding countries. I mean, this is a very important problem. And the degree to which Britain has to be seen as something that helps to spawn an imperial appetite, but also has literally left the material structures to make that possible. Okay, the military that Mandela inherits at that election is just a fantastically powerful military that has Israeli, American, British material at its disposal that tomorrow could unseat Mugabe, no question, right? So it's not simply what these countries do, as in the case of India. Yes, many of us may be critical of the border relationships, but it's also what they don't do that they could do. I mean, that's always the gambit of the post-war era, right? Once you also have nuclear weapons on the scene, and this is part of what's going on with Iran now, and it's what's going on with Israel now. I found it extraordinary, if I may say so, to see people of the ostensible left saluting the Israeli bombing of Syria this week on television. I find this extraordinary. And I say that as an American, but I also say that just in general as someone watching the news. So I mean, I think these things are very important what you're bringing up, and the vocabulary the academy comes up with is not adequate. Post-colonial is not adequate. A-colonial is not adequate. And we don't, I sat in, I won't say who, but Vikram and I sat in a seminar last week in DU, where South Africa's was discussed without any reference except my own to the marijuana shootings. There was no reference to what the Zuma government has been doing in relation to its own people. It was all on the up and up, And obviously it's a critical moment right now for that country. So, part of my question as a British historian is what responsibility do the British still bear for some of that? And also, where do people go when they don't want to deal with that? They go to Britain. That's one of the things that happens. And so I think that has to be, historians need to confront that as part of how we get to where we are now. So your questions are very pertinent. Where was number one now? I think number one was C.L.R. James, number two was this life, this cinema. Anything else that's burning from the three of you who just asked things? No? Very good, very difficult questions. Very difficult.
I'd like to abuse the position of the chair and ask a question of my own. I was fascinated by what you've presented here, and I definitely want to get a copy of the book and also just, go through it. There aren't really proper questions, but comments and thoughts I had. So one is, of course, which was raised earlier, this complicated relationship of the race and the left. And I keep going back to the first song, Do That, because it brought back a tune I remember hearing it as a kid as well, except I think Bugs Bunny was in it, if I'm not mistaken, if I remember clearly. And I was just wondering as well, while these left actors are indeed, anti-racist as well, but there's this very odd kind of reliance on the fantasy of race that persisted from the end 19th, 20th century as well. So it's the intentions are there, but they're sort of getting trapped in that racial fantasy, and it takes a lot of struggle to leave that racial fantasy behind. And I was just wondering, about the process which you have dealt with, but it's still, you see that fantasy still persisting in the left. So when it tries to talk about a united world, but then this sort of contradiction comes in. The other thing that I was thinking about was about this. So we see this vast network of leaders and characters, and many of them who are very important. We see Nehru's name, we see Turkana, Jomo Kenyatta came up. Incidentally, Jomo Kenyatta was one of the first native anthropologists, student of Malinowski. So for our students in sociology, do a lot of ethnography. He's an ethnographer turned national leader. The thing is that you have these people who are very actively involved in struggles, anti-colonial struggles, labor struggles, but people like Nehru and Kenyatta were also very much part of the elite in that sense, at least in their respective countries. So this negotiation from people who were sort of ostensibly socialist communists, but they become full-fledged elites. They presided over governments that were often known to crack down to some extent upon dissenting voices in their respective states. Or at least when you give a picture of Nehru, Indira Gandhi was rather notorious for the crackdown she did on left-wing activism in Eastern India at one time. So I was just wondering of these sort of biographies of these people, as you mentioned, they go in and out of communism, but sometimes they swing the other way as well. If not in terms of ideas, but definitely in terms of political practice. And it's just about how these characters negotiate these kind of changes in their own practices and ideologies as they're part of the network. Just a very quick thing again. I was just fascinated by seafarers, but that's just personal interest. And sort of the connection of the left and the seafarers, which is especially when you brought up the image of Hamburg, and how sort of a lot of left-wing activism took place with seafarers. So it's this kind of multiple strands of travel that's sort of coming in. And how do we see that continuing to some extent, even beyond after the Second World War, or has there been a gradual shift in that with the change in the seafaring industry? So it's very minor. Sure.
I'll take the last one first. The maritime workers are really where it's at in terms of doing this work. I mean, it's the critical sector because people can only move globally up till the war by sea. So the whole air travel thing is just not there. And so you're getting a much slower, this goes back to something you raised about whether it was easier to organize. That's a complicated question. I think about it a lot. I've been able to get grant money saying, that IT stuff became increasingly important for South Africa, but I'm with you in what you're saying. But remember that there are millions and millions of people, even if I say how important maritime workers are, the vast majority of people in the world in the 1930s never leave their village. It's like the Maasai warriors, I don't know if you know this story, it's in rural Kenya, who called the American embassy 6 months after 9/11 and asked a representative to come to their village to receive a sacred sacred cow on behalf of the victims of 9/11, because they just found out about it from someone who came to the village and described people falling off buildings that were very high. And they were so traumatized by this, and they wanted to make a gift to the American people. So, that wasn't within 15 years of this moment. And I'm sure those of you living in Asia, in the regions you come from, can fully recognize that. Okay? It's like people who came out of their houses in Katrina. One of the most amazing things about Katrina were the news photos of people who'd never been photographed before, the phenotype. This is a very complicated point I'm going to make, but there are anthropologists here, so I'm going to make it anyway. The phenotype amongst people had an enormously endogamous feature to it. This was not part of our African American population that had moved much amongst others or married. The facial structure were very similar. This is very unusual in what is a completely polyglot ethnicity. That's because these people were so poor that their families had intermarried and had children in these same neighborhoods since the era of slavery, since people arrived from villages in Africa. This is extremely unusual, and there's a photographic record of it. So, as far as the poorest people, they are not even involved in maritime, okay? I want to cite the opening up of the surveillance records in Britain. For those of you who ever plan to work on something like this in the UK, there's been a huge effort, I say this under someone we all may not love, Tony Blair, to open up archives. And the surveillance records for Asian seafarers, for Lascars as they were called, are just extraordinary. I did not get to use them for my book, but someone who's going to be in Delhi in the next few months and may come to speak here, Ani Mukherjee, if you ask him, has been working in these, he's teaching in Central Asia now, he's teaching in Kazakhstan. He has shown me these files, and when people got off the ships, it's like the British in India, some of the great archives we have for the Raj, were when people who were illiterate were interviewed, okay? This This happened with seamen coming off the boats who wanted, say, to go visit somebody in England. They had to give a full interview. And the Brits started asking them, what political organizations have you belonged to? So you're starting to move down the slope, but you're still not getting to the very poorest people. So one of the most incredible things about the Scottsboro case is this is very poor. These are people from extremely poor families. This is very unusual to find this level of documentation. Most were illiterate, which in the U.S. at that time, was even at that time, I should say, it was still a sign of considerable poverty. And so, I think that you cannot simply get fascinated with the possibilities for maritime, but it's certainly the richest way in to what we've been talking about here. If one is doing this kind of bedrock social and economic history, which I was trained to do, it's not what I'm doing with these projects, which clearly are about elite folks, no question. I would also submit to you, you may disagree, the left is almost always made up of people who are parts of the elites, unless they are part of a mass political social movement. I mean, that's the nature of being part of the left. There's an ideological baggage that people are carrying. They almost have to be literate unless there's an extremely strong oral tradition, as in peasant parties and such like, that are organized in regions where there's not high literacy. Now, so-called left movements are using the IT culture in an extremely sophisticated fashion that, I think you're right, deorganizes everyone into individual units. I'm not a media, theorist here, but obviously this is a problem, for example, with what's happened in Egypt. That you have this movement that's very web-based, that achieves a huge amount, which is now turning back in on itself, fragmenting in a very violent manner that can't necessarily easily be resolved, in my humble opinion, in civil society, partly because of the nature of how, and the same applies to Syria. I mean, there's a kind of mixture of social movement with something that's driven partly by technology, by the immediate politicization of people because they're in touch through a particular medium. And that's very different. These movements that I'm talking about have more in common with the 18th century than they do with the 21st century. These are very basic social movements. You show up and you listen to Saklanwala speak. It's like as a kid, I saw people like, Bobby Kennedy speak. I mean, my parents took me to the Senate chamber, and I saw these guys out on the floor of the Senate, as a tourist kid, right? I mean, that just doesn't exist, like now, even in American culture. So, or in Britain, most people had seen, and even now I would say, probably have seen their MP speak. So this oral vernacular that grows up is very important. This relates, I think, back to the question of racial paternalism that Anker's raising. Of course it's still with us as a world global phenomenon. In your lifetime, you're going to see major incursions against it that were not seen in my lifetime. And the Obama presidency is one of those. It's an incredible leap forward, no matter what one wishes to say in difference with his politics. So those things are happening. This starts to make it difficult for this racist paternalism to continue to permeate everything. But I think, it's still there in all the power relationships that exist. And, I will say very frankly in this room that, I find it very difficult. I feel conflicted even with my background and my politics and so on when I see that the Calcutta labor movement has said that if the president ever shows up in their city, they want to throw him out of his ears. I mean, all of that is very difficult because, again, what the needs of a social movement may be in one context are pitted against, the recognition that barriers are broken in another way. I was saying this, by the way, I hope it's understood it here, that the president is a highly educated person who cannot say about 90% of what's on his mind. in terms of political ideas, I think. So that has to be borne in mind when we speak about him. I mean, he's of the generation of people who inherited all the feminisms and Marxisms and all of that were part of being educated in his time. So you just need to be aware that we've never ever had a president. It's not just that he's the first black president, maybe the last, but that he is the first person in office, apart from Bill Clinton, with full access to that range of ideological variety that you would take for granted here in India, as students in India, regardless of where you're actually from. So I think that's important. This is, yeah, I mean, it's a big, and Judah, I mean, I think at a simple level, I should say also what's obvious to you, that there are cultural barriers that mean that the celebration of one thing in one culture that people may consider to be a compliment, say, to African Americans may appear as a racist thing in another culture. So that gets us to the question of national boundaries and the nationalisms, and why do Kenyatta and Zuma, why does Zuma's police fire on trade unionists? Or, why does someone like Robert Mugabe, who was a great hero to my generation, turn out to be, a dictator? He was a school teacher, and I remember him as a youngster. So, I think these are questions that all of us know in some gut level the answer to, that the nation state demands that of its leadership. Very difficult to avoid it in the present arrangements of world government. Very difficult to avoid the corruption of it. And the necessity to defend one's own people and one's borders and so on. It goes with the territory. And so, that gets into the degree to which empire is being replaced by something that's still failing as a system, in terms of some of the human goals that some of these movements have or did have. And these are questions that we all can ponder in our work. I don't think that I have any monopoly on an answer. In fact, I'm too old to have a really good answer. It's to young people, I think, to think more very creatively about that problem. Because I very much come from the era of the nationalism and of the anti-imperialisms, the anti-colonialism, becoming struggles for the establishment of nation states, or in my own country, for the betterment of our states, not its overthrow. That's very passe in the United States, if it was ever fashionable. So, I'm really tired now. I don't know. Other questions?
There's one more.
Okay.
We can end it here.
Yeah, because then I can chat to people a little bit informally. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Kelsey Atney, and I'm actually also here through Fulbright Nehru Scholarship. And you touched upon it a little bit. I was just going to ask that, as you said, your focus has largely been on the radicals, the intellectual, the elite, with notable exceptions like Ada Wright. But thinking of the Goddard movement in San Francisco and the idea of rallying diaspora communities, and the image of Hamburg, are you able to even just briefly speak a little bit more to the relationship these elite intellectuals had with the immigrant and diaspora communities nearby where they were working, when they were abroad, when they weren't in South Africa, they weren't in India? That might be a long question, I apologize.
This is a really good question. Okay, it's a good question. Let me say in defense of myself, not all these people are intellectuals. I don't know how we define intellectual fully, but I mean, someone like Willy Munzenberg is from a hardcore working class background, no secondary education. So you're talking about the ability of a social movement to educate people. These folks were in prison with Mandela, who is, you want to talk about elite, who is, of course, a royalty within his community. Many of these people, Jacob Zuma is one of them, went to Robben Island illiterate. They learned to read and write in prison. These are not the Chittagong raiders who are sitting around reading Bryce and so on. This is, these are people who are without any education. And people like the Scottsboro defendants also learned to read and write in prison. So in some ways, the Indian case is actually a case where you have an educational infrastructure here that's very widespread compared to some of the other social movements. This is a highly educated left compared to, for example, the United States, which is an immigrant country in which very few people on the left came from the established families like my own, for example. I would be by far the first person in my parents to some extent ever engage with the left. I come from Southern military, slavery, all of that in my family. So no trace of anyone on the left. The most you would get are Roosevelt liberals, and that's it. So that's very typical of people who come from, the oldest families in the country of different class backgrounds. India, you could speak about elites in politics. Obviously, there are many figures who are not that here, and I think that holds right across the board. The way this plays itself out is exactly in the way that your second question proposes. That is, someone arrives in another country. They look for people who come from their country. So Padmore sets up shop in his house in London, and people from the Caribbean who are very ordinary people who serve, for example, in the RAF during the war, or who serve in the military from the Caribbean, show up to talk to him and get him to help with local legal matters. I interviewed someone in Trinidad a summer a year ago who was an RAF pilot who decided to become a lawyer in Britain, worked his way up, got a letter to Nkrumah from Padmore so he could go to Ghana at one point, and described, going to Nkrumah's living room, Padmore's living room, and getting this letter, right? So, I think you have these amazing networks of people from all backgrounds. The Gadar people and all of those people around Mrs. Kama, people who were part of the Indian sociologist group, people who were, these are folks that Saklagwala and Nehru to a certain extent. Nehru's very engaged with the whole rugby Cambridge scene and all of that. But Saklagwala was involved in social work and street organization. So, I think you do get an interplay that's profound. And that's very characteristic of the American left. I really want to underline how unintellectual, shouldn't surprise you, the American left is. It's not a very intellectually driven country. It's not just that it seemed that way to you. It never was that, okay? So that, you talk, the biggest problem the Communist Party had, for example, is no one spoke English. They had to have what we call the foreign language groups, including the Yiddish groups, for all the Jews who were lefties, because they could speak English. So, I think, we need to have a picture of this that is pretty fluid. Luckily, in the project I'm engaged in now, when there are real human beings who are alive whom I can speak to, the possibility of talking to people down the social ladder is greater. Less so in India because of language acquisition issues for me. But in South Africa, it is possible. And in Trinidad, which is the other place I'm working, it's possible. And then I think it's very possible in England, which is where this work ends, not where it begins, where I will go at the end. You could walk into Portobello, there are Punjabi secessionists in there. There are people around who speak English, who are parts of sort of broader circles that would be worth talking to for certain kinds of questions I'm dealing with here. But this begins to be not a history project, just in case you think that the whole historical establishment embraces what I'm talking about. Many of you work in ethnography or anthro. I would be more comfortable in some ways within that framework for some of what I'm doing with this particular project. It's very, very contemporary. And so for a living, I teach, from the 1640s onward. Okay? So this is like what you do when you're not doing that. But if you are a modern British historian, you are usually responsible in the United States for teaching from at least the 18th century onward. Then we've got to have some rudimentary command of what's happening in the empire, which is very difficult to acquire, as you all know. I mean, it's so complex. It's a life project, so. Pleasure. Okay? Okay, I really do thank you for your patience. I recognize that this is very demanding for folks who have so many interests and knowledge that are beyond mine, and I even recognize the language, the way that I speak may be more demanding for some of you, and I really appreciate very much your patience, and look forward to talking to you afterward. Thanks.
Thank you. So, thank you very much, Professor Pennybaker, for coming to spend your time for this wonderful presentation. I want to thank Dr. Bianca for the discussion provided the kickstart, and thanks to all of you in the audience participating. We'll continue the conversation now over tea just outside.